And we are now joined by Professor Eugene Kontorovich. He's a professor at Northwestern University School of Law in the United States and a senior fellow at the Kohelet Forum here in Jerusalem. Hello, Professor Kontorovich. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, pleasure to be here.
So I've got a really fundamental question for you to start with. Can legislation deter terrorists at all? Is it even possible?
Well, it's a great question, and I think we need to break it into two kind of parts. One is, can legislation stop terrorism, and the other is, can it affect somewhat the rate of terrorism? So even no crime can be absolutely deterred. That's why there's crime despite life prison and the death penalty. At the same time, we don't abolish punishment for crime because it's not a complete deterrent. And there's evidence that crime can deter terrorism. And part of the evidence is that terrorists act on incentives in part. Which is why there is funding from the Palestinian Authority to terrorists and their families, which is why that funding is based in part on the severity of the punishment that terrorists get to try to offset it. So certainly the Palestinians believe that terrorism responds to incentives, and most things respond to incentives within some bounds, and you shouldn't get an exaggerated idea of what the effect is going to be, but at the same time, one shouldn't think that it's a completely invariant phenomenon. That you can't
but if we take the incentives, the financial incentives that are offered by the Palestinian government, as you just pointed out, it has been consistent for a while now. This is not a new thing, and yet we've seen various levels of terrorist activity among Palestinians. So perhaps there's no clear correlation between the two.
It's true. These benefits have been around for a while, though sometimes the levels go up and down. Now, obviously, they're not. It's not a monocausal phenomenon. That is to say, they're not doing it just for the benefits, for example. But if there are other causes present, the benefits can be often a necessary or helpful contributing cause. So obviously, we can't deal with all of the causes. Those aren't all within our ability to affect, but to the extent that we can affect some of them, it seems at least possible.
Do you think that the recent legislation that's offered by the Israeli government, be it revoking the residency permit or house demolition or not returning bodies of terrorists to the families for burial, do you think that these measures might affect the level of terrorism in the long run?
So again, things like affecting the level of terrorism is an extremely complicated criminological, sociological issue which people can be debating about for years. Just to give an example, there's a massive debate amongst scholars: does the death penalty deter murder? And 40 years of studying the question has not led to a firm conclusion. These things are very hard to prove statistically.
What do you think?
One way or another. I think, first of all, these measures vary greatly, and there's a lot of different ones. I don't believe legislation has been introduced on all these points. Some of them, like stripping residency, for example, isn't aimed at deterrence. I think it's aimed at prevention. That is to say, by stripping residency privileges, it makes it harder for people to get to Israeli population centers and simply harder to commit crimes in the future. So that's not necessarily merely deterrent. Now, similarly, financial penalties, of which house demolition is a part of, because for many people, not all of their money is in the bank, or most of their money is not in the bank. It's in the value of their real estate and personal possessions. That could be, I think, in principle, effective. Again, at the margin. Is it going to change everybody's mind? No, but especially given that we see that there are programs designed by the Palestinians to provide financial incentives, at least offsetting or negating those incentives could have some effect. It's hard for me to understand the issue of returning bodies. I think that's more on an emotional and symbolic level, and so
I have a more legal question, legalistic question for you. Because the residents of East Jerusalem, they have a very special legal status. They are permanent residents by virtue of living in a territory that has been formally annexed to Israel, but they aren't full-fledged citizens like the Arab residents of Israel proper. And how does this status fit into the considerations that come into play when it comes to passing these measures?
Okay, that's a great question. So, obviously, what's being discussed with regards to the residents of East Jerusalem, Arab residents of East Jerusalem, is revocation of permanent residency status, because that's the status they have. Mm-hmm. Now, why do they have that status? It's because they were offered citizenship and chose not to accept it for political reasons. Mm-hmm. So they could have had citizenship. They're still eligible to apply in an expedited fashion for citizenship, but instead they chose this permanent residency status. Now, not surprisingly, that choice has legal consequences, because it's easier to remove the status of permanent residency in any country, in America, in Europe, than it is citizenship, which is much more of a vested right. But let me go even further. What we see from other Western countries, and this is the crucial point, what we see in other Western countries have legislation and use it often quite vigorously, allowing even removal of citizenship based on terrorist or anti-government activity. And I don't mean just countries like Russia. I mean, the United Kingdom, most prominently, has a law allowing, on the unilateral decision of the Home Minister, to strip citizenship from people who are engaged in terrorist activity, incitement, or subversion of the government, even when they're not convicted. And recently, Canada has copied that legislation, also allowing for denaturalization, though they do require conviction. And the United Kingdom uses this very aggressively. They denaturalized 20 people last year. So if it's within democratic norms to actually have denaturalization without a conviction for people engaged in Islamic terror, then a fortiori Kohelet, it would seem that stripping residency would be well within the norms. And I think the most important point is this contention. So whether these are good measures from a policy point of view is very debatable, and I'm far from sure that they're good. That they're all good ideas from a policy point of view. And that they'll all be effective, but that's a question. That's
also because it would mean perhaps the de facto division of Jerusalem, because if the residents of East Jerusalem would be eligible to be stripped of the residency permit, it would mean that it would no longer be under...
because that's based on the status that they've chosen. That is to say, Israel, when it annexed Jerusalem, said people here can now get citizenship if they want. Right? We're not discriminating amongst the residents of the territory, and if they choose not to, that's not a question of the status of the territory, but of the personal...
Do you think that these measures would apply to any Israeli citizen or resident, even Jewish ones?
Well, first, again, the discussion of stripping residence is based on permanent resident status, and that that is different from stripping citizenship. Right. But it certainly should apply to any resident. Now, there's a question whether other residents are engaged in what in this case amounts to mass murder or incitement to mass murder, but it's hard to find the reason why it shouldn't be. Now, you could say the same thing, by the way, about the British and Canadian programs. If you look at the people that Britain has stripped, I believe 40 out of 40 are involved in Islamic terror. So do you say, does that risk the division of Britain? Does that risk the creation of a... But
were these 40 people immigrants, or were they
different?
Native
some were
Brits?
Immigrants, but many were born in Britain.
All right. Okay, Professor Eugene Kontorovich, I'm afraid this is all we have time for, so thank you so much for joining us today.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.